Welcome to the National Arts Club. My name is Catherine Kleszczewski, and I am happy to have you join us for today's NAC at Home program. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. If you want to become a member of the National Arts Club, please email admissions@nationalartsclub.org for more information. Today, we are so excited to have Dr. Kimberly Chrisman-Campbell, author of the book, Worn on This Day, The Clothes That Made History. And here's a little something about her. Kimberly Chrisman-Campbell is a fashion historian, curator, and journalist, and is the recipient of a 2020 NEH Public Scholar Award. She holds degrees from Stanford University, the Courtauld Institute of Art, and the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. She is the author of Fashion Victims, Dress at the Court of Louis XVI and Mary Antoinette, which won the Costume Society of America's Milena Davenport Publication Award. She has a new book coming out this December of 2020 called The Way We Wed, A Global History of Wedding Fashion. She writes about fashion, art, and culture for the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Politico, and the Wall Street Journal. A former curatorial fellow at the Huntington Library and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, she has lectured at museums around the world, including the National Gallery and the Met, and has appeared as a fashion commentator on the Biography Channel, NPR, and Reels. She lives in Los Angeles. I am so happy and honored to present to you Kimberly Chrisman-Campbell. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you. Good evening, or to those of you on the West Coast like me, good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen with you now.
Okay. Oh, before I need to ask you a first question.
Sure.
But before I do that, following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat box function for any questions you might have. So my first question is, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've been wanting for a long time to write a book about how fashion and history interact and how important fashion is to our memory and our understanding of history. And I realized that in order to do that, I couldn't tell that story. I had to kind of show it. So this is how I'm showing you the ways that fashion has played a role in some of the most important events in not just American history, but world history, and how our perception of those events is changed by what was worn on that day.
Fabulous. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton on to you, Kimberly.
Well, wherever you are, thank you for joining me here for this National Arts Club at Home event. As a fashion curator, I've always been fascinated by the reasons why clothes survive and find their way into museum collections, because it's almost never for the reasons you would expect. By that, I mean it's not because they're the most perfect expression of what people habitually wore in a finite and clearly defined time and place. Think about the things in your own closet that have been there for 3 or 4 or 5 years or even longer. They're probably not the clothes you wore every day. Those got worn out, or went out of style, or weren't worth hanging on to. Rather, they're the things you preserve for sentimental reasons, like your wedding dress or your Letterman jacket, or things you didn't wear very often because they were ridiculously trendy or didn't quite fit, or you bought them for a special occasion and kept them because they were expensive or because they were in such good condition that you just couldn't justify getting rid of them. Or maybe you just forgot they were there and they survived entirely by accident. If you're lucky, you might have a few timeless pieces like an old leather jacket or a pair of cowboy boots that you still wear a lot, but it's because they're neither fashionable nor unfashionable. They're classic. Well, the same applies to clothes that eventually find their way into museums. Linda Baumgarten, the longtime costume curator at Colonial Williamsburg, has written that survival of any artifact for hundreds of years usually favors the beautiful and the unusual, which explains why museums are full of gorgeously beaded and embroidered formal garments, but short on everyday clothing, especially of the middle and lower classes. But things also survive by chance, or for sentimental reasons, or because they weren't actually worn very much at all, or because they were in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong time. Museum curators use the word provenance to describe the critical background information that anchors a garment or any other work of art in a specific moment in history. An object's provenance is its chain of ownership. The clothes you're wearing right now already have a provenance. And if you were to donate them to a museum, the curators would want to know who made them, who wore them, and when and where, and maybe even how much they cost. That may be easy to do with the clothes you put on this morning, but it's much more difficult if we're talking about an old black top hat that you found in your attic or an antique store. An object with a verifiable provenance is more valuable and less likely to have been stolen or faked or otherwise obtained unethically. But rarely is a garment's provenance straightforward or readily available. It requires curators to do intensive research and make educated guesses where the object's history can't be documented. Because in the vast majority of cases, we simply don't know who made or wore a garment, much less when and where. Designer labels have only been in use since the 1860s. This is a very early labeled gown made by Madame Olympe of New Orleans in around 1865. It's now in the collection of the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. A trained curator can usually date a garment's creation to within about 5 years or less. But of course, it may have been worn many times over several years by several different people. If a garment does have a designer label, it can often be narrowed down to a single fashion season. But I've noticed that when a piece can be dated to a single day, there's usually a really good story behind it. And those are the stories I wanted to tell in Worn on This Day, The Clothes That Made History. Worn on This Day is different from any other fashion history book that I've written or read. Instead of the usual linear chronology, starting at one point in history and moving forward over decades or centuries to another point, it begins on January 1st and ends on December 31st, looking at garments worn on monumental occasions in different years from the 1st century right up to the present. There's no right way to read this book. You could read it cover to cover, or day by day, or just dip in and out of these capsule histories, jumping from Pompeii to pink pussy hats and everything in between. Most people look up their birthdays first. Rather than a traditional timeline of changing hemlines and hairstyles, it mashes up styles, stories, and personalities, taking us on a journey of discovery through fashion's fascinating history, one day at a time. Each day of the year is represented by a garment or outfit with a newsworthy narrative, whether famous and glamorous or anonymous and humble. Prominent figures like George Washington, Marilyn Monroe, and Princess Diana appear alongside ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events. Seemingly mundane or even ugly garments are transformed by their circumstances into priceless totemic objects. Anthropologist Nicholas Thomas has pointed out that objects are not what they were made to be, but what they have become. And every piece in this book has two histories: its provenance, how it came to be, and what it came to mean. Wearing a garment gives it meaning beyond its material history or intrinsic value. An antique textile dealer once told me about a woman who called her wanting to sell a black dress worn by her great-great-grandmother, who had died in the 1850s. Not another Victorian black dress, the dealer thought, rolling her eyes. The caller continued, "My great-great-grandmother was a slave." The dealer nearly dropped her phone in shock, then invited the caller to name her price. Clothes known to have been worn by enslaved people are as rare as Victorian black dresses are commonplace. Sometimes it's the man or woman who makes the clothes, not the other way around. In other words, every wedding dress is special to someone, but only Kate Middleton's wedding dress could bring in $15 million in ticket sales during just 2 months on display at Buckingham Palace. Clothes reveal ineffable truths about not just individual lives, but also collective values and experiences. Garments act as totems and taboos and retain their power to impress or intimidate long after they were first worn. Museums collect but rarely display things like Nazi uniforms and Ku Klux Klan robes, like these from the Ohio Historical Society, precisely because they so powerfully evoke events and emotions that most visitors would prefer to forget. At the same time, old clothes acquire new and problematic meanings. For example, many museums are reluctant to display furs today because they may offend animal lovers, even though fur has been an integral element of dress for thousands of years. I admit that a day-by-day history of fashion is a bit of a gimmick, but it resulted in some surprising discoveries and thought-provoking juxtapositions. A traditional chronological order may trace the evolution of fashion over decades and centuries, but fashion also evolves through the seasons, bringing Easter bonnets, June brides, 4th of July flag waving, Halloween costumes, and ugly Christmas sweaters, like this one belonging to President Gerald Ford and worn at his family's cabin in Vail. Doesn't he look cozy? Events like the Oscars, the Met Gala, the Kentucky Derby, and the Olympic Games happen at the same time from year to year, making their own highly anticipated fashion statements. When you measure time by days rather than by years, the Duke of Windsor's wedding to Wallis Simpson, whose faded blue Mainbacher wedding gown you see on the left, and its inevitable consequence, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, wearing the magnificent Norman Hartnell gown on the right, are only 1 day apart. So are the Olympic victories of Australian swimmer Claire Dennis, who was almost disqualified for showing too much shoulder blade in her racerback Speedo swimsuit in 1932, and Ibtihaj Muhammad, the first American athlete to compete in a hijab. After their long and highly publicized trials, during which the media lavished attention on their sharp suits, O.J. Simpson and Al Capone got their very different verdicts just a couple of weeks apart. In many ways, imposing this artificially narrow lens actually allowed me to take a broader and more inclusive view of fashion history than a more traditionally structured book would. I wasn't limited by time period, geography, or nationality, as long as I could find an exact date. It gives equal footing to people traditionally underrepresented in museum collections, the poor and working class, the marginal and the minorities, like these Mexican-American men rounded up by the Los Angeles Police Department after a week of racially motivated civil unrest known as the Zoot Suit riots, many of them arrested for no other crime than their fashion choices. The book covers all 7 continents, as well as clothes worn in outer space and under the sea, encompassing the indigenous and non-Western cultures that are so often excluded from the story of fashion. Even encyclopedic museums rarely have the opportunity to make these kinds of narrative leaps. The project pushed me out of my comfort zone as a scholar, and I hope it will do the same for readers, challenging them to reconsider, as I've had to do, what fashion is and what fashion does, because it's not just pretty party dresses. The book includes many firsts. The first three-piece suit worn by King Charles II on October 15, 1666. The first baseball uniform worn by the New York Knickerbockers on the left, consisting of blue woolen pantaloons, white flannel shirts, and wide-brimmed straw hats. The first burkini, worn by Lebanese-Australian volunteer lifeguard Mekalala on the right. It also includes a lot of lasts. Many garments survive precisely because they were the last ones someone wore before their life was tragically cut short by an accident, a natural disaster, or a bullet. On the left is the breastplate worn by a French cavalry officer at the Battle of Waterloo, which was no match for the Duke of Wellington's cannons. On the right, the top hat Abraham Lincoln wore to Ford's Theater on the night of his assassination. People also tended to preserve the clothes they wore when they narrowly escaped death. I found a lot of these, and they're among my favorite pieces in the book, as you'll see in a few minutes. Initially, I tried to avoid garments intended to be worn a single time, such as wedding dresses, masquerade costumes, christening robes, or coronation gowns. While these are exactly the kinds of clothes that tend to be preserved for their monetary and symbolic value, and they can be dated very precisely, they rarely reflect the current fashions of their times or the everyday dress of their wearers. Clothes that survive due to an accident of history have more to teach us than those created for a carefully planned ceremony or celebration. That said, I could not resist including a few wedding gowns, including this one worn by Ruth Lengel when she married Major Claude Hensiger in Pennsylvania in 1947, which you can probably tell is made from a nylon parachute. During World War II, the fashion industry was conscripted for the war effort, and textiles were hard to come by. Wedding gowns and lingerie made from recycled parachutes were common. But this parachute is rather special because the groom wore it too. It saved his life when he bailed out of his B-29 bomber after the engine caught fire over Japan. He kept it and gave it to his future bride, and years later, their daughter wore it for her own wedding. It's now in the Smithsonian. Of course, the idea of wearing a wedding gown only once is actually a very modern one. In the 19th century, a bride was expected to wear her wedding gown again and again, whether she was rich or poor. A woman often got married in her best dress, regardless of the color. The white wedding gown was popularized by Queen Victoria when she married Prince Albert in 1840. But it was by no means the rule, and many of those white gowns were repurposed as evening wear. Queen Victoria wore hers every chance she got. The purple wedding gown on the left was made and worn by a lady's maid, not because she was poor and wanted something practical that she could wear again, but because she felt that at 35 she was too old to wear white. This is why provenance is so valuable. If you found this in your attic or an antique shop, you might never know it was a wedding gown, or that white was considered more suitable for young brides. During World War II, when new clothes were scarce, wedding gowns might be passed around between friends, and many war brides chose day dresses or suits like the one on the right, worn for a Jewish wedding in London. The suit is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, but I accidentally stumbled across the bride's oral history in the Imperial War Museum and learned that she had served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force during the war, and the only outfit she owned was a brown tweed D-mob suit, the cheap drab suit given to servicemen and women when they were discharged. Though the war was over, rationing was still in effect, and her friends donated their clothing coupons so she could buy this stunning red wool suit to wear on her wedding day, and undoubtedly on many days thereafter. Just as many wedding gowns were reworn, I was surprised to learn that a coronation gown is not necessarily a one-time only affair. The gown Queen Mary wore for her coronation on the left made a second appearance 6 months later at the Delhi Durbar, a coronation celebration held in the colonial capital of India. Queen Elizabeth wore her Norman Hartnell coronation gown on the right no fewer than 7 times to various official events in the UK and the Commonwealth countries. Though there's more than 40 years between these gowns, they share some obvious similarities. Most of us will witness another coronation in our lifetimes, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the next Queen of England wears and whether she wears it more than once. At first, I also intended to avoid clothing worn on the runway, the red carpet, or the stage, on the assumption that clothes worn in these strictly performative contexts rarely represented mainstream fashion or even belonged to the people who wore them. But once again, I found that wasn't always the case. In the 19th century, many leading ladies had their own designer stage costumes, which they wore regardless of what everyone else on stage was wearing. This is a cloak the Australian opera singer Nellie Melba commissioned from Paris couturier Jean-Philippe Worth, who also made many of her everyday clothes. She wore it whenever she performed the wedding scene of Wagner's Lohengrin. And even if you know nothing about opera, you'd recognize the music played in that scene as "Here Comes the Bride." There were only 21 pairs of these Alexander McQueen armadillo boots, custom made for the runway, and they were not sold commercially. But Lady Gaga borrowed a pair for the MTV Music Video Awards, and she later bought 3 pairs when they came up for auction. Halloween and masquerade costumes may not be fashion per se, but they often act as a mirror of culture, reflecting larger social and sartorial trends. And elite fashion designers have always dabbled in costume design. The lavish themed costume parties of the 19th century allowed couturiers and their clients to give free rein to their imaginations and budgets, as partygoers competed to dazzle each other with the most elaborate and innovative costumes. Society photographers often set up mobile studios at these parties, and the pictures were published in the papers or as postcards or in commemorative photo albums. So there was an Instagram aspect to the experience. Alice Vanderbilt attended an 1880 ball costumed as the spirit of electricity. In this Charles Frederick Worth gown equipped with concealed batteries, which lit a bulb that Alice carried aloft like the Statue of Liberty's torch, casting beams over the glittering gown, which is now in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. Another major costume ball, this one of the 20th century, was Truman Capote's star-studded black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel. Once again, top designers were kept busy making new gowns and elaborate masks for the ball, including Halston and James Galanos. Clothes allow us to try on different opinions as well as different identities. Paper dresses enjoyed a brief vogue in the turbulent 1960s, when young people literally wore their politics on their sleeves and discarded them like so much used Kleenex. The Pittsburgh Press photo on the right captured what the paper called brightly clad young Nixon girls at a 1968 campaign rally, just a few days before his election. Surprisingly, a handful of these disposable dresses have survived. Graphic t-shirts were another fashion statement that flourished in the 1960s and 70s. Cheap and mass-produced, they were first embraced as marketing vehicles, but quickly became devices for political and personal expression. On March 18, 1984, designer Catherine Hamnett attended a British Fashion Week reception hosted by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at 10 Downing Street, wearing an oversized t-shirt of her own design, reading 58% don't want Pershing, referencing Thatcher's unpopular decision to allow American Pershing cruise missiles to be based in the United Kingdom. Hamnett made the shirt a couple of hours before the event and kept her jacket closed until the moment she shook Thatcher's hand, surrounded by photographers. These graphic t-shirts became Hamnett's signature, featuring black block capital slogans that were designed to be legible from 20 or 30 feet away and easy to copy, so their political messages would have the widest possible impact. It may seem counterintuitive for a designer to invite copycats, but it succeeded beyond Hamnet's wildest dreams 2 months later, when the pop group Wham wore her suicide prevention t-shirts in the music video for their hit song, Wake Me Up Before You Go Go. It may be more difficult to make out the lettering on Marianne Vecchio's t-shirt. It reads, slave. Vecchio was participating in a student demonstration at Kent State University when the Ohio National Guard opened fire, killing 4 people. This Pulitzer Prize-winning photo has become an icon of the Vietnam era, but Vecchio's t-shirt is often illegible in reproductions and has received little attention from historians. Probably handmade, it delivers an all-purpose cry of oppression. Slave might refer to ideological slavery, the draft, or the civil rights movement. Like her flared jeans customized with flower power decorations and her ethnic-inspired sandals, it is an androgynous garment. Her long, lank hairstyle, too, was increasingly worn by men. This anti-fashion fashion statement sums up the do-it-yourself, anything-goes aesthetic of the era. Things don't always survive in one piece, but they're no less valuable for that. In the second half of the 19th century, gowns were usually constructed in 2 parts, a bodice and a skirt, and sometimes came with a second bodice. So you'd have one with long sleeves and a high neckline for daytime, and another like this with short sleeves and a low neckline for evening. These bodices tend to survive without their voluminous skirts, which frequently got upcycled to make new gowns. This is an evening bodice worn by Empress Eugenie of France, probably created by her favorite couturier, Charles Frederick Worth. She put it on to accompany her husband, Emperor Napoleon III, to the Paris Opera House. As they pulled up outside the theater, an Italian anarchist threw a bomb at their carriage. Miraculously, they survived, though 8 bystanders died and dozens more were injured. She may have preserved the bodice as a memento of her narrow escape. Shoes, too, frequently survive with and without their mates, probably because they're small and portable as well as ornamental. They are also not as likely to be recycled as other garments, which can be recut to fit new figures and fashions. This high-heeled silk shoe trimmed with ribbons belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette, who lost it along with her watch, purse, and locket when she fled the angry mob that ransacked and looted the Tuileries Palace during the French Revolution. Though not a single outfit known to have been worn by Marie Antoinette has survived, several of her shoes have. The 9/11 Memorial Museum has more shoes than any other category of object. Most of them are damaged and dirty. Some are partially melted or bloodstained, like these worn by Linda Raish Lopez, who worked at Fiduciary Trust on the 97th floor of the South Tower. She took off her new heels to navigate the stairwell as she evacuated, but put them back on as she walked north to the Hudson Pier through the rubble-strewn streets of Lower Manhattan. It wasn't until she got off the ferry in New Jersey that she realized they were covered with blood. For those in the Twin Towers, as well as those on the ground, footwear took on life or death importance as they rushed to safety. Other shoes have survived because of the physical feats performed in them. Roger Bannister wore the kangaroo leather cleats on the left when he became the first man to run a mile in less than 4 minutes. They weighed 4.5 ounces after he sharpened the spikes to make them thinner and lighter. Marie Taglioni was the first ballet dancer to perform on pointe. Today, women wear street shoes modeled after ballet shoes, but early ballet shoes were adapted from street shoes. The only thing that sets these apart from fashionable shoes of the time are the toes, which Taglioni darned to reinforce them so she could dance on them. She wore this shoe when she performed for Tsarina Alexandra Fedorovna in St. Petersburg, and later gave it to one of her students as a keepsake. Sportswear often predicts the future of fashion. introducing high-tech materials and aerodynamic silhouettes that only much later filter down into everyday dress. If you want to know what we'll all be wearing in 10 years, look at athletes. This is the British women's 400-meter relay team at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, the first year women were allowed to compete in swimming events. I picked the British team because they won the gold medal, but I could show you pictures of any of the female swimmers from the 1912 Olympics, and they'd all be standing in this exact same pose. The competitors were obviously uncomfortable being photographed in their skimpy and see-through wool swimsuits. And you can see why when you look at the woman standing behind them, dressed in what was at the time conventional day wear, with a floor-length skirt, long sleeves, and a high neck. This is French tennis star Suzanne Lenglen curtsying to Queen Mary at Wimbledon in 1926. Lenglen was the first female player to bare her arms and legs at the All England Club. People called her revealing outfits indecent when she first entered the tournament in 1919, but she won the championship and became a fashion icon on and off the court. Her tennis clothes were made by the couturier Jean Patou, whose brother-in-law was a nationally ranked tennis player. Here it is the young athlete and not the queen who is the fashion influencer. I love this photo so much that I started looking for more sartorial odd couples. I'm sure you recognize the pair on the right, but you may not know about Coco Chanel's 1957 visit to Dallas as a guest of Stanley Marcus, the head of Neiman Marcus, who hosted a Western-style hoedown in her honor at his brother's ranch, where the entertainment included a cow fashion show. Today, Chanel is a fashion legend, but at the time she was at a low ebb in her career, struggling to recover from World War II, which had devastated both her business and her reputation. It was her successful comeback in America, orchestrated by Marcus, that put her back on top. That and the iconic Chanel suit she's wearing, which would become a day-wear staple in the post-war years and also appears on the cover of my book. In some cases, the language of fashion and the language of history are inextricably woven together. The bikini took its name from the Bikini Atoll in Micronesia, where the US tested the atomic bomb on July 1st, 1946, just a few days before the skimpy suit made its public debut at a poolside press conference in Paris, modeled by exotic dancer Micheline Bernardini, because no professional model would agree to wear it. She's holding the tiny box it came packaged in, advertising its diminutive size. The newsprint pattern referred to the newsworthiness of the style. Depending on who you asked, the name referenced the swimsuit's explosive nature or the fact that it was the size of the debris left by a nuclear attack. The verb to handbag entered the Oxford English Dictionary thanks to Margaret Thatcher. It was defined as to verbally crush or attack a person or idea ruthlessly and forcefully. As Britain's first female prime minister, Thatcher once described her handbag as the only safe place in 10 Downing Street. The accessory became a symbol of her feminine yet fierce leadership style. She cannot see an institution without hitting it with her handbag, one of her political rivals complained in 1982. The black Asprey purse that Thatcher carried when she joined President Ronald Reagan and his dog Lucky for a walk in the Rose Garden in 1985 bagged $39,800 at a charity auction in 2011. Like sportswear, military and industrial equipment often predicts fashion innovation. And I really enjoyed getting into the specialized archives of places like the Imperial War Museum, the Science Museum, and the National Air and Space Museum. The first Ray-Ban aviators were developed by a test pilot looking for better protective goggles. This World War I era tank mask looks futuristic while also harkening back to medieval armor. It was designed to protect tank crews' faces from flying metal splinters that resulted when bullets shattered against the tank's armored steel plates. Several of these masks have survived because they are designed to be indestructible. But we know that this one was worn by Second Lieutenant Hassel, who commanded one of the 378 British tanks that fought in the Battle of Cambrai. This is the flight suit that Charles Lindbergh wore on his historic voyage from New York to Paris on the Spirit of St. Louis, the first solo transatlantic crossing. We know this because he recorded the date he wore this suit on the underside of the collar. Beyond the fact that they were saved for posterity, there is often evidence that the people who wore these history-making clothes knew that they were important. They carefully signed, dated, or labeled them. Neil Armstrong wore this suit when he became the first man to walk on the moon. Designed to last 6 months, the 80-pound, 21-layer suit recently underwent vital conservation work in anticipation of the moonwalk's 50th anniversary in 2019. Most of those 21 layers were man-made fibers like nylon, lycra, neoprene, and dacron that could be found in any woman's lingerie drawer. The suit, called the A7L, was designed and constructed by the International Latex Corporation, who co-opted fabrics and seamstresses from their subsidiary Playtex, the bra and girdle maker. It's a fitting origin story for a suit that had to be comfortable as well as functional, allowing enough mobility for Armstrong not just to take one small step, but also to gather soil samples and conduct scientific experiments. Of course, that's not Armstrong in the photo on the right. It's second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong was holding the camera, so the only image we have of Armstrong in the suit on the left, on the moon's surface, is the one reflected in Aldrin's visor. It may be hard to believe, but the A7L has a lot in common with both of these pieces, and all three were designed with mobility and functionality in mind, using the latest technology and the most advanced materials. Things like uniforms, armor, folk dress, and undergarments tend to be used again and again over long periods of time, yet it can be hard to pinpoint them to one specific day. So I was very excited to locate a couple that could definitively be linked to historic events. As you may be able to guess from the silhouette, the armor on the left belonged to King Henry VIII. It was commissioned for the tournament celebrating his fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, which was annulled after just 6 months. The armor definitely outlasted the marriage. He must have worn it over a period of several years, in fact, because it was altered as the king's waistline expanded. The corset on the right is also connected to a wedding. Unlike Henry's expensive custom-made armor, it was purchased off the rack from a department store and worn by a Londoner named Vivian Williams under her wedding dress. Thanks to the new elasticized textiles, corsets no longer had to be custom-made. Williams, like a lot of people, saved her wedding underwear, likely for both sentimental reasons and because it was too delicate or too specialized to wear every day. While corsets had largely been replaced by bras before World War II, they made a comeback when Christian Dior launched his ultra-feminine hourglass-shaped new look in 1947. Stockings and garters would soon be replaced by tights, which came into style as skirts got shorter and shorter in the late 50s and early 60s. In the age of eBay, the value of clothes as historical documents has soared. This ratty secondhand grandpa sweater that Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain wore on MTV Unplugged sold for $137,500 at auction after he committed suicide 4 months later. Late last year, it came back on the market and netted more than twice that figure. Rolling Stone contacted me before the most recent auction and asked if I could date the cardigan and figure out its original selling price. Essentially, they were asking me to fill in the gaps in its provenance. I didn't think it could be done because it's a pretty generic piece, which is undoubtedly why it appealed to Cobain's anti-fashion sensibilities. I knew that it was made by a company called Manhattan, but similar knitwear had been produced by a few different firms with Manhattan in the name. Luckily, the auction house was able to provide a photo of the label, which helped me narrow down the date based on when the man-made fibers it contained were trademarked, and also included a logo that helped me pinpoint which Manhattan manufactured it. Ads in back issues of Sports Illustrated, Esquire, and the New York Times chronicled the brief fad for men's mohair sweaters in the first half of the 1960s. They were especially popular on college campuses and golf courses, which is probably not the look Cobain was going for. These helped me date Cobain's cardigan to late 1964 or 1965, when it probably retailed for about $15. As I said, sometimes the man makes the clothes. I'd like to end with two of the most heartbreaking pieces in the book, which have a profound historical connection. This watch was worn by Roy Bourine, a sailor on the USS Oklahoma, on December 7, 1941. President Roosevelt famously called it a day which will live in infamy. The ship was anchored in Pearl Harbor, and Bourine had just finished breakfast and reported to his desk in the ship's pay office when the call to battle station sounded. Glancing out a porthole, he saw a Japanese bomber overhead, so close that he could see the pilot grinning. 3 torpedoes hit the Oklahoma in quick succession. The watch is stopped at 8:04 a.m. The moment Bourine dove 50 feet into the water as another plane fired on the ship, which capsized, killing a third of the crew. Bourine survived and later donated the watch to the World War II Museum. The attack on Pearl Harbor set in motion a chain of events that culminated on August 6, 1945, when Nobuko Ushita, a 13-year-old freshman at First Hiroshima Prefectural Girls High School, put on this school uniform that she had made herself in her second period home ec class. Because of the war, school was suspended, and Nobuko and her classmates were cleaning up debris from bombed out buildings. They were just half a mile from ground zero when the atomic bomb was dropped at 8:15 a.m. Miraculously, Nobuko survived the initial blast, and with the help of rescue workers, made it home to her parents' house 20 miles away, where she died later that night. Since it was first worn in the 1920s, the Western-style Japanese schoolgirl's uniform, or seifuku, with its sailor collar and pleated skirt, has become an iconic symbol of Japanese culture. This mangled, burnt, and stained survival is both instantly recognizable and horribly changed. These are wrenching stories, and I'm not the only one affected by them. Over and over again, I found evidence that historic clothing has been speaking eloquently from the past to the present for hundreds of years. This is the uniform that Lord Horatio Nelson wore aboard the HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, a bittersweet moment in British history, for England won the battle but lost her heroic admiral to a sniper's bullet. He had refused to remove the many shiny honors on his breast that almost certainly identified him to the enemy. But legend has it that he had the presence of mind to cover them with his hand or handkerchief as he was carried below deck to die, so his men would not recognize him and lose morale. The uniform is now in the collection of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where the author Virginia Woolf saw it in 1926. She wrote in her diary, "Behold, if I didn't burst into tears over the coat Nelson wore at Trafalgar, with the medal which he hid with his hand when they carried him down dying, lest the sailors might see it was him. I read it all when I came in and could swear I was there on the Victory." Clothes can transport us back in time with a "you are there" quality that evokes powerful emotions and memories. They take us back to the moment when history was made in an instantly relatable and powerfully visceral way that no mere headline or history book can match. These wearable time capsules transcend mere fashion to make up the fabric of history. Thank you so much for listening. I will be happy to take your questions now, But first, I want to invite you to follow me on social media, where I post a new piece worn on this day every day. Books on Call in New York is handling book sales for the National Arts Club at home as usual. But if you'd like a signed and personalized copy of the book, you can order one using the link on screen. It's not too early to start thinking about the holidays, and this would make a great gift for the fashionista in your life. The pandemic has been really hard on independent bookstores, and we all need to support them or they're going to disappear. The Ripped Bodice here in LA is one of my favorites, and I'm going to stop by next week and sign a bunch of books for them. So if you order one this weekend, you'll get 10% off with my own special coupon, Cool Closed. Over to you, Catherine. Do we have any questions?
Yes. Kimberly, I just wanted to say that was absolutely fabulous. What
Thank
a
you.
fabulous presentation. And I held on to every word as I was reading questions. There is actually a couple, actually I have a question that I have from me. During your research, what surprised you the most while working on this book?
What surprised me the most? That's a great question. I was really surprised that that coronation gown got worn 7 times. I think a lot of my own preconceptions I had to get over, because there were several things that I wasn't even intending to include in the book because I thought, well, they're not really important, they don't matter, and they turned out to be very important, and they do matter very much. And the fact that a wedding gown or a coronation gown is something, or a theater costume is something that actually does tell us so much about the person who wore it and the times it was worn in, was one of those surprises.
Great. All right, well, there's a couple of other questions, quite a few questions actually, but there was one that in particular that a lot of people asked at the same time, and that is, what were some of the images you wanted to have in the book, or some objects that you wanted to have in the book, but you weren't able to include it?
Yeah, there were some great things that I just couldn't find a single date for that I would have loved to include. I really wanted to include a Fortuny Delphos gown. Fortuny was a designer in the early 20th century who did these wonderful pleated dresses, and people wore them all the time, and they're just amazing. And people even handed them down to their daughters, and their daughters wore them. So they've been worn constantly for about 100 years without ever going out of fashion. Yet trying to find one with an actual date on it proved to be impossible, even though they're so popular and so common. So that was a bit frustrating.
Yeah, and didn't you tell me earlier that the dates for Pompeii were actually changed too?
Yes, the week after I submitted the manuscript, the date of the eruption of Pompeii changed. After 2,000 years of people thinking it was in August, it turns out it was in October. So I had to do some quick rewriting there because I wanted to make sure I got the correct date for Pompeii. And I ended up having to switch around a few things because I didn't want to lose Al Capone, and there were some other things that I had to then fill the gaps in. So luckily it happened though, but when there was still time to make those changes.
Yeah.
And I think they found that out because of some plants that only bloom in October were found in the ruins.
I see. So I guess that leads me to another question, and that is, if you wrote this book today, what images would you include?
Oh, I would have loved to put in a few things that we've seen just in the past year. There was a great wedding picture, for example, with California wildfires in the background. And the idea of this bride and groom, standing in front of these fires in their finery, I thought was very much a sign of the times. And of course, masks would be in there. There are actually a lot of masks in the book already, but not masks worn for COVID reasons.
Yeah, I think I saw a question in there also too. Angela writes, what was your favorite time period to research for fashion?
My favorite time period has always been the 18th century. I wrote my first book on Marie Antoinette, and that's probably always going to be my favorite time period. But I loved getting into time periods that I hadn't ever explored before, and areas of fashion like sports. I'm not an athlete. I didn't know a whole lot about sports history and sports fashion, but there's a lot of that in the book because so many of the innovations in fashion have happened in sports, and so many of the cultural debates I think have played out on the tennis court or on the football field, and that's all in there.
Okay, great. There was a question that was asked by Anne, and she asked, I've developed a mild obsession with sumptuary laws. Do
Yeah.
those, do those factors in your research for this book, do you factor into your research for this book at all? Are there
Yeah.
any outfits that you would have been forbidden to people of certain classes and races?
One day of War on this Day is devoted to Peter the Great's beard tax, when you had to pay a tax if you wanted to have a beard because he was trying to modernize Russia and he didn't want people to have beards anymore. There's another sumptuary law that has to do with kimonos in Japan. So those have been a really important part of fashion history. I think, though, they have been more honored in the breach than in the observance, because the fact that people make these laws tells us that people were breaking them and that they continued to break them because they had to pay fines and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. There's another question actually from Wanda, and her question is, millinery played a significant role in fashion history. Have you included any hats in your book?
I have included a lot of hats, and I actually had to drop one of the hats, unfortunately. The Dalai Lama is sort of a hat fashion icon. Unfortunately, this book was printed in China, and they would not let me write about him. So that was one big surprise too, because that was the last thing in the book that we had to take out because of the printer objecting to that. But there are other wonderful hats in the book, and I think that the straw baseball hats are probably my favorite, because I love the idea of people playing baseball in big straw boaters.
Oh, great. I was, yeah. So would that be on your Instagram page, that picture you weren't allowed to print in your book?
I have put him on there a few times because he gets hats wherever he goes. He gets cowboy hats, he gets baseball hats. He's always got a hat on and is always happy to pose for a picture. And the hat associated with whichever city or country he's visiting.
Exactly. All right. So here's another question from Samir. Is there interference in between fashion codes through time? The past gets into the present, and why?
Yes, absolutely. Fashion revivals are not a new thing. They've been going on forever. And fancy dress is often historically focused. There's a lot of that in the book as well. And of course, referencing the past in your wedding dress or your coronation dress is a way of emphasizing the importance of the event, really, and plugging into this continuous tradition of marriage or of royalty or whatever it might be. So I think when the past is used in fashion, it tells us something about the present as well, and it tells us what we're aspiring to be, and that we're taking things, I think, seriously in a way. If it's a, for example, a wedding dress, it often doesn't look like something people wear today. It looks like something people wore 100 years ago, and that's a deliberate choice. And we automatically associate that with the gravity of the occasion.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. I always find that culture is like a virus, that it just passes through generations and generations in some shape or form.
And nothing is new in fashion. It's all been done before. I'm really surprised by anything.
There's another question actually from John, and it says, I imagine there are many instances of definitive dating. But were there instances where the dating was uncertain? I think we covered that with Pompeii, for example.
Yeah, and a few other things. We were chatting earlier about a hat that was worn on Mount Everest by Edmund Hillary, and it's in lots of pictures, but none of them have a date on it. And a lot of things like uniforms, armor, underwear, things that we know were worn frequently, but it's very hard to pinpoint a date because people took them for granted. They were things that were so familiar and so much part of life that no one kind of took note of it or wrote the date on the collar.
Yeah. And Fred writes, were there any pieces of clothing you did not want to include, and why?
And I didn't want to include, well, there were actually more things I wanted to include that I couldn't include because for some dates there were 10 or 12 great things and they all happened on the same day and I had to pick one, and that was really hard. there were a few dates too where I really just didn't have anything, and I had to kind of dig deep into the New York Times archive or the Vogue archive and try to find something. The Library of Congress is great for dated photographs, but I ended up, I think, telling some stories that speak to each other across the years and across the centuries, and finding some parallels that I wasn't expecting to find. So I was happy in the end with what got in there, but it often involves some hard choices.
Yeah, actually, as I was reading your book, and I did it both ways. I started from the beginning, and then I stopped at April, and then I jumped around because I was like becoming impatient with myself, and I wanted to like, what were the other important dates? You know, you have on your cover, for example, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, and well, Jackie Kennedy at the time. Mm-hmm. And I actually, how did you decide on that cover? That was another question in the book.
That was a pretty easy decision, actually, because we wanted something that everyone would recognize. And I think there are a lot of things in the book that you see and you recognize, but that was one that we knew would be instantly recognizable to everyone. And something too that where I think the fashion has become so much a part of our memory of that day. And if that suit had been any other color but pink, would it mean the same thing to us? It became so much a symbol of America's loss of innocence, that for me, it really epitomized what the book was about. And to go back to the previous question about what I didn't include, I didn't include a photo of everything, and I would have loved to. It would have been a 6-volume book though, so where I felt like a photo was essential, I put it in. There are more than 120 pictures in the book. They're gorgeous, but I wish I could have had 365 pictures.
Yeah, when I was going through the book, I was noticing that I was actually looking up and Googling, like, for example, the Oscar of Barbara Streisand's from 1970. And I never even heard of this fashion designer, I guess because of the time, that time. And it was just absolutely gorgeous. So I think when people, purchase this book, I mean, yes, of course, not every picture is going to be included, but they can always look on the internet and they can always see what it actually looked like.
Yeah, and I definitely included the photos that you're not going to find on the internet, because a lot of them, they're things you either remember or you can easily look up. J-Lo's Versace dress, for example. We all know what that looks like. Or if not, we can find it very easily because Google Images was created for that dress.
There was another question, interesting question. It says, did you include any pins from Madeleine Albright? And I guess maybe to expand on that question is maybe, did you include any jewelry at all?
Well, Madeleine Albright is in there. I included her talking about some pins she wore when she was meeting with Yasser Arafat. Her memoir, Read My Pens, is great, and she really understood the symbolism and the power of fashion. And there is a lot of other jewelry in there, tiaras, some sentimental pieces, as well as some very dazzling and beautiful and valuable pieces.
Oh, great. And we only have a few more minutes for a couple more questions. So let me see. Actually, I'm going to ask one of my questions. What advice would you give to someone who would be interested in writing a book?
Well, if you're going to write an illustrated book, that's a much different story than writing a non-illustrated book. I always tell people, figure out where those illustrations are coming from, how many you're going to use, who's going to pay for them, because they can be hard to get. I was really fortunate for this book. I had to personally ask the Queen for permission to reproduce her coronation dress. I got a photo from the Mormon church that's, a historic garment that to them is a relic of their religion. I was able to use royal pieces from Korea, some very meaningful and important things that are national treasures, as well as being costume treasures. So it was not guaranteed that they were going to let me use them, and I was very grateful that they did. But getting pictures can be very difficult and very expensive at times. So if you're working with any kind of illustrated book, you almost have to figure out the illustrations before you figure out the text.
Yeah. So what's next for you? I know you have this book coming out, The Way We Wed, and it's coming out in December of this year. Are there any other upcoming projects that we should know about?
Yes, I've got a couple of things in progress. The Way We Wed is almost a sequel to War on This Day because I found so many wonderful wedding dresses as I was researching the book, and I couldn't include them all. It just would have been too many wedding dresses. I had to really pick and choose. But I thought, why not just do a whole book on the wedding dresses, because it's another wonderful subject. And there have been a lot of books on wedding dresses. I wanted to go kind of beyond the white dress, look at bridesmaids, look at grooms, look at guests, look at the mothers of the bride, and look at other cultures and time periods where white was not the norm. So I think if you like Born on This Day, you will very much like The Way We Wed. I'm currently working on a book called A Dozen Dresses, which is going to look at the history of women in the 20th century through some key dresses that then influenced other designers. So 12 very influential dresses that then sort of were copied or inspired. The wrap dress, for example, or the little black dress. You can probably guess what some of the major styles are. And I just recently received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to work on my dream project, which is the biography of designer Chester Weinberg, who is a designer most people have forgotten, but I love very much. And he was active in the late 60s and the 70s, and was a real New Yorker. So he's kind of the Halston that you've never heard of. And I can't wait to share more about him with people.
Yeah, I can't wait to get your book, The Way We Wed, and all the other books that you're working on. I just want to just thank you so much for, for your time and coming on and presenting your work. It's just absolutely fascinating. And I want to mention too, I also bought your book.
Oh, thank you.
And I have to say, I felt like I was in a time machine, literally. I know we can't really go anywhere. I mean, I know some people are traveling, but you can't really go anywhere. But hey, travel through time. And the way you can do it is through reading this book. And I just found it so fascinating. And I learned so much about fashion and about history, and the way the world has developed. And it's a different perspective, actually.
I learned a lot too. It really challenged me, and I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And I'm so glad I could be here tonight. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so thank you so much for presenting. And I want to remind everyone to please go into the chat box, and her book is available. And if you look at all the links, there's one which shows that she has a discount, and also and she'll sign the book for you. It will be available through Sunday. Is that right? And
the discount only works this weekend, but you can buy the book anytime.
Okay, yeah, and then then also this video will be available on YouTube, and then below the comments, all the links of your books will be available. So I want to thank you so much again for your time, Kimberly. It was just absolutely, I was wowed. I was just absolutely transformed into the world of fashion. And I also want to let everyone know, for more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at the National Arts Club or nationalartsclub.org, or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you so much, Kimberly.
Thank you. Very great to be here. Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.